Cancer does not announce itself. It begins in silence. Somewhere inside the body, one cell copies itself wrong. Then another. Then another. And eventually a doctor sits down across from someone and says three words that change everything. It takes decades off a life. It takes parents away from children. It takes children away from parents. It empties out entire families. It shows no mercy for age, effort, or how much a person still had left to do. Cancer is one of the most merciless forces in the natural world. And here is the part almost nobody expects. It did not start with us. Most people assume cancer is a fairly recent problem, something that showed up alongside factory smoke, packaged food, and long hours spent sitting behind a desk. Those modern habits genuinely do raise certain risks, and nobody is arguing otherwise. But the actual origin of this disease reaches back far beyond anything resembling a factory, a grocery store, or an office chair. It reaches back before written language existed anywhere on the planet. It reaches back before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before anything we would recognize as a town or a village. It reaches back to a time when the closest thing to medicine available to anyone was a trusted elder pressing a hand against someone's forehead and hoping for the best. The story of cancer does not begin with modern civilization at all. It begins with the basic, unavoidable act of a cell dividing, something every complex living creature has been doing since long before anything resembling a human being ever existed. To understand why that matters, and why the fossil record itself backs this claim up in a way that is genuinely hard to argue with, it helps to look directly at what scientists have actually dug out of the ground. If a subject like this one, patient, evidence-driven, willing to sit with an uncomfortable question a little longer than most videos are willing to, is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you without any extra effort on your part. Researchers examining a fossilized foot bone recovered from a cave system in South Africa identified it as belonging to an early human relative, a member of the Australopithecus lineage, or possibly early Homo, dated to somewhere around 1.7 million years old. The bone showed unmistakable signs of osteosarcoma, an aggressive form of bone cancer. This was not a healed fracture or an old injury. It was an actual tumor, growing inside a creature that walked the earth long before our own species ever existed. The team that identified it used detailed scanning technology rather than relying on the naked eye, since the internal structure of a malignant tumor can look deceptively similar to ordinary bone damage from the outside. In that same set of remains, researchers also identified a separate benign tumor in the spine of another individual from a similar time period, meaning two distinct kinds of abnormal growth turned up in the same general population at a time depth that predates modern humans entirely. Scientists refer to abnormal tissue growths like these as neoplasms, and discovering them in fossils pushing 2 million years old tells us something significant. Cancer is not a recent invention. It is genuinely ancient, and it was already firmly present at the very root of our family tree, long before anything resembling a modern human being ever stood fully upright. Cancer overwhelmingly affects soft tissue first: organs, skin, blood, the parts of the body that decompose quickly and leave nothing behind for a fossil hunter to ever find. What actually survives across deep time is bone, which means the fossil record we do have almost certainly represents a small fraction of the cancer that genuinely existed in ancient populations. Researchers call this a preservation bias, since we are only able to observe the cancers that happen to leave a permanent mark on hard tissue, which means every fossil case we do find should really be treated as the visible tip of a much larger, mostly invisible iceberg of soft tissue cancer that simply never had a chance to survive the passage of deep time. This is exactly why mummified remains have become such a valuable source of evidence, since mummification preserves soft tissue in a way plain fossilization never can. Researchers using modern imaging technology, including detailed internal scans, have identified tumors inside Egyptian mummies that are thousands of years old. One large-scale study scanned well over 100 mummies and found clear evidence of cancer in a meaningful portion of them, including tumors located deep in organs that would have been completely invisible to any physician of the era, discovered only because modern equipment could finally look straight through preserved, wrapped tissue without ever having to unwrap it. Between the bones and the mummified remains, a consistent picture emerges. Ancient people got cancer with some regularity, and we do not have to rely solely on physical remains to know this, because ancient people wrote about it directly. An Egyptian medical text known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to roughly 1600 years before the Common Era, describes bulging tumors of the breast in unusually direct language, and the physician who wrote it plainly noted there was no available treatment. That is an extraordinarily blunt admission from a doctor writing nearly 4,000 years ago. Centuries later, the Greek physician Hippocrates, working around 400 years before the Common Era, gave the disease the name still tied to it today, using a Greek word that translates to crab, apparently because the swollen veins surrounding a tumor reminded him of crab legs radiating outward from a central body. The Roman physician Celsus later carried that word into Latin, giving us the term we still use in English right now. Later Greek physicians went even further and used the word for crab claw, specifically to describe the finger-like projections a tumor sends into surrounding tissue, a surprisingly accurate anatomical observation made entirely without dissection tools or any real understanding of cell biology, based purely on careful, patient, external examination of patients over the course of long medical careers. Ancient physicians outside the Mediterranean world reached similar conclusions independently. Early Chinese medical texts describe firm, immovable masses that worsened over time and resisted every treatment available, using terminology that translates roughly to accumulated hardness, while classical Indian medical writing describes tumor-like swellings and explicitly separates them from ordinary abscesses or infections that could actually be cured. None of these traditions were in meaningful contact with one another at the time, which makes the overlap genuinely striking. Across multiple civilizations and thousands of years, physicians working in complete isolation from each other independently observed cancer, described it carefully, and tried to make sense of it long before anyone understood what was actually driving it at the cellular level. To understand why cancer has always been part of life, it helps to understand what cancer actually is at the cellular level. Cancer begins when a single cell picks up a mutation, meaning its genetic instructions get damaged or copied incorrectly during division. The body has built-in systems that catch and repair the overwhelming majority of these errors automatically. Occasionally, though, a damaged cell slips past that internal correction system entirely. It starts dividing without restraint, forms a growing mass, and eventually pushes into surrounding healthy tissue, sometimes eventually breaking free entirely and traveling through the bloodstream to establish new tumors in completely different organs, the process doctors refer to as metastasis, and the stage of the disease that tends to be the hardest to treat successfully. These mutations are not some rare malfunction. They are a basic, unavoidable feature of biological life itself, happening every time any cell divides anywhere in the body. The more cells an organism has, and the longer that organism lives, the more individual opportunities exist for one of those mutations to slip through undetected. This is why cancer risk climbs sharply with age, in essentially every species studied so far, and why organisms with unusually large bodies made of enormous numbers of individual cells face a statistically higher raw number of chances for something to eventually go wrong, a straightforward numbers game that plays out identically whether the organism in question is a mouse, a human, or a creature many times larger than either. Every organism built from dividing cells carries this same underlying risk. Ancient dinosaurs developed cancer. Ancient fish developed cancer. Even trees can develop cancer, forming visible, woody growths called burls that show many of the same uncontrolled growth characteristics found in animal tumors. There is direct fossil proof of this reaching back tens of millions of years before any human relative ever existed. Researchers examining a fossilized duck-billed dinosaur from what is now Canada identified a large, aggressive tumor in one of its tail vertebrae, complete with evidence that the cancer had already begun spreading into surrounding bone by the time the animal died, essentially an ancient case of metastatic cancer preserved in stone. Researchers had initially assumed the growth might simply be an unusual healed injury, until closer analysis ruled that possibility out entirely. That fossil alone demonstrates that cancer is not just older than our species. It is older than nearly every large land animal we tend to picture when we think about deep prehistory. Paleopathologists studying that specimen were able to compare its internal bone structure directly against modern medical scans of human osteosarcoma patients and the two matched closely enough that a radiologist unfamiliar with the fossil's origin might easily mistake one for the other, a striking reminder that the underlying biology of a tumor has barely changed across roughly 70 million years of evolutionary distance. So, did ancient humans actually develop cancer less often than people do today? The honest answer is very likely yes, though not for the reasons most people assume. The single biggest factor is simply how long people lived. Most ancient humans died relatively young, from infection, injury, predators, or periods of famine. Average life expectancy for a prehistoric human is generally estimated somewhere between the mid 20s and mid 30s. Cancer typically requires a long runway to develop, with most cancers emerging well after the age of 50. If a person dies at 30 from an infected wound or a violent encounter with a large predator, cancer simply never gets the years it needs to fully develop. This is not just a theory built on guesswork either. Researchers studying skeletal collections from later, better preserved archaeological populations, where enough individuals survived into genuine old age to actually study age related disease at scale, consistently find cancer rates climbing sharply in exactly the older individuals who managed to beat the usual odds and live well past what was typical for their era. The same pattern we would expect if age itself, not the ancient environment, was doing most of the real work. Ancient humans also faced a genuinely different set of risk factors than people do now. They were not smoking tobacco. They were not exposed to industrial chemicals. Their diets consisted almost entirely of whole, unprocessed food, and their bodies stayed in nearly constant motion. All of that likely reduced certain specific cancer risks. But their world was not some cancer-free paradise either. Smoke from cooking fires irritated lung tissue over a lifetime. Chronic parasitic infections and long-term inflammation are known to promote certain cancers. Unprotected sun exposure raised the risk of skin cancer considerably. Ancient people were not living free of cancer risk. They were simply dying of other things first, before cancer ever had the chance to catch up with them, which is a very different claim than the popular idea that ancient life was somehow biologically protective against the disease in any meaningful way. There is a modern piece of evidence worth adding here that connects directly to this idea. Researchers studying present-day populations that still live a largely traditional, non-industrial lifestyle, including forager, horticulturalist groups living in the Bolivian Amazon, have documented dramatically lower rates of the chronic diseases that dominate modern life, including several cancer types linked closely to inflammation and sedentary living. These are living, breathing populations today, not fossils, and their health data functions almost like a natural experiment, offering a real-time glimpse of what cancer risk might look like for a human body operating under conditions closer to how our species lived for the overwhelming majority of its history. Researchers working with these communities have specifically noted extremely low rates of the cardiovascular and metabolic conditions that dominate causes of death in industrialized countries. And while cancer still occurs, the specific types most strongly linked to inflammation, obesity, and sedentary behavior appear noticeably less common, supporting the idea that lifestyle interacts with underlying cancer risk in ways that go well beyond simple exposure to a modern chemical or two. Given all of that ancient evidence, it is worth asking directly why the disease seems to dominate modern headlines and modern hospitals, in a way it never seemed to for most of human history. So, why does cancer feel so much more common today than it apparently was in the deep past? Part of the answer is that people simply live longer now. Modern medicine has eliminated or sharply reduced many of the things that once killed people early, which means millions of people now reach their 60s, 70s, and 80s, exactly the window during which cancer is most likely to develop and actually get detected. Another major part of the answer is detection technology itself. We can now locate a tumor smaller than a fingernail buried deep inside the body using imaging tools. Ancient physicians could not have imagined, from detailed cross-sectional scans that build a three-dimensional picture of internal organs to blood tests capable of flagging tiny traces of genetic material shed by a tumor long before it would ever produce a noticeable symptom. Ancient doctors could only identify what was visible externally or felt just beneath the skin, which means the overwhelming majority of internal cancers throughout history went completely undetected and unrecorded, quietly ending lives that were simply attributed to a general wasting illness or vague stomach complaint with no further explanation ever given. And yes, modern lifestyle factors genuinely do raise certain cancer risks in ways ancient humans never experienced. Tobacco use is directly linked to cancers of the lung, throat, and mouth. Heavily processed red meat is associated with colorectal cancer. Obesity is connected to well over a dozen distinct cancer types, and unprotected ultraviolet exposure remains a leading cause of skin cancer. Alcohol consumption independently raises the risk of several cancer types as well, and chronic exposure to certain industrial chemicals and air pollutants has been tied to elevated cancer rates in specific occupational groups, none of which existed as a meaningful daily exposure for anyone living before the industrial era began. Understanding just how ancient cancer actually is turns out to be genuinely useful for researchers working on it right now. If cancer has existed for millions of years across countless species, it means the disease is woven directly into the basic mechanics of multicellular life itself, not some isolated modern glitch. Scientists have been closely studying why certain very large, very long lived animals appear to develop cancer far less often than their size and lifespan would statistically predict. A puzzle researchers sometimes call an evolutionary paradox of scale. Elephants, for instance, carry many extra backup copies of a specific cancer suppressing gene, effectively giving their cells a much larger built in safety net before a single mutation can spiral out of control. And researchers are actively studying whether that same genetic mechanism could eventually inform new human cancer treatments. Naked mole rats present an even stranger case, showing an almost complete natural resistance to tumor formation throughout lifespans that run far longer than similarly sized rodents should biologically be able to achieve, apparently thanks to a unique substance in their tissue that causes cells to stop dividing the moment they get packed in too tightly, essentially an automatic brake against overcrowded, runaway cell growth. Labs around the world are still working to fully understand exactly how their cells manage that trick and whether any version of it could ever be adapted for human use. There is also real value in comparing ancient hominin remains directly against each other. A rib fragment recovered from a Neanderthal individual at a site in Croatia, dated to roughly 120,000 years ago, shows structural changes consistent with a bone tumor, offering yet another data point from an entirely separate branch of the human family tree, evidence that cancer was not unique to our own direct lineage, but touched multiple related species, navigating the same basic biological rules. That particular Neanderthal individual lived long enough for the abnormal growth to become clearly established in the bone, which tells researchers this population, much like early Homo and Australopithecus before them, was also caring for and supporting individuals dealing with a serious, debilitating illness, rather than simply abandoning anyone who could no longer contribute to the group's survival. By comparing ancient tumors like these against modern ones, researchers can track how specific cancers evolve over time and start narrowing down which conditions seem to consistently trigger them across wildly different environments and eras. Cancer is not simply a modern medical inconvenience. It is a deep evolutionary puzzle, one that has been running quietly in the background of complex life for as long as cells have been capable of dividing and occasionally getting it wrong. A tumor buried inside a foot bone nearly 2 million years old, carried by a creature that lived before language, before controlled fire, before anything resembling civilization, is proof that this fight predates every single thing we now consider part of being human. It is one of the oldest adversaries our lineage has ever faced, quietly present in the background across nearly the entire length of human evolution, hidden inside Neanderthals, hidden inside our own direct ancestors, hidden even inside animals that walked the earth tens of millions of years before the first primate ever existed. Every generation before us either died before it caught up with them or lived and died without ever understanding what was actually happening inside their own bodies. And for the very first time in that unbelievably long, difficult history, we finally have real, genuinely effective tools capable of fighting back, built directly on the same fossilized evidence, the same ancient texts, and the same strange, cancer resistant animals this video just walked through.